everyone. I wanted to give you a brief review of some of the key concepts that we've covered so far in this course, partially as sort of anticipation for your midterm and partially to sort of just reinforce some of the things in this very compressed summer course. I'm not going to go over every single detail. Mostly this will be hopefully just a reminder of some of the different concepts, so that if there's something you think that you need to go back and refresh yourself on, you can go back to the reading or the lecture or post a discussion question on the discussion boards, and basically make sure that you feel comfortable with these different concepts. And also as a reminder of things that you might want to be thinking about in terms of how you might incorporate it into your final report. Obviously, I'm not expecting every single final report to incorporate every single concept, but the more you can really think and use these concepts as sort of a heuristic to say, well, what is my technology in relation to this? Or how could I comment on this or talk about this in a way that feels integrated into my final report, that would actually help improve your report. So this is going to be pretty quick, but here I go. So we talked about regulation, and there you can look at both the lecture and the why regulate reading. And we asked, why might we regulate? And so we talked about some of the environmental and social justice reasons. In the lecture, I talked about the shirtwaist triangle shirtwaist factory in relation to labor regulation, labor laws, as well as the Cuyahoga River example to talk about environmental protections. But then in the reading, you also learned about market failures. So you might want to go back and revisit what is a market failure and how does that express, how are there a whole range of reasons you might regulate in relation to market failures. So if you recall, there were things like monopolies, windfall profits, externalities, and there was a whole list of these, right? Externalities, I think, is a concept that I would think would be useful to most, if not all of you. And I think it's just a really important concept to think about as a STEM student because I think almost anywhere you look, you can really ask yourself, what are the externalities here? How are the costs, the true costs of this? If we were going to do a whole life cycle assessment of this technology, what would be the true costs, and how does that relate to what we're actually paying or what even the companies are having to pay? What does it mean for us that, I think, what is it? iPhone is on its 10th version since it was first established. What does it mean if people are going through smartphones every 2 to 3 years or faster? What does it mean that we have like these really cheap textiles from at H&M and some of these places, in terms of the externalities, the things that are not captured in that $5 sweater? What does that mean for the environment? What does it mean for labor? A whole number of things. So I think that it's a really useful concept that I think, like I said, most of you could incorporate pretty readily. Keep in mind, I'm not sure how much I emphasize this, but it's administrative agencies, which are part of the executive branch, that create and enforce regulations. So the Environmental Protection Agency is an administrative agency. It's part of the executive branch, which is why when you have a new president, like the Trump administration comes in, he's able to appoint the heads of these different agencies. So Scott Pruitt became in charge of the EPA, and that's a way that the executive branch exerts some power on science and technology, because then the agency is sort of answerable to someone who presumably is somewhat like-minded to the president. Regulations can be in the form of soft law as well. So soft law refers to norms, conventions, standards, things that where it's not about a legally binding or compelling kind of rule, but it's sort of what you should do. It might be best practices, codes of conduct. And then there's also this top-down command structure, which is more thou shalt or thou shalt not, right? So this is, you cannot emit more than such and such, or you will be prosecuted. So both things can be considered regulation. We talked about living in a risk society, and for that you might want to look at the risk lecture where I talk about Ulrich Beck and his ideas about risk and modernity. When he talks about modernity, he's really just talking about post-industrial revolution and a fundamental shift in the way, and he would argue, in how risk should be characterized. So we're not just thinking about risk like natural disasters, but risk becomes what we produce through our technological artifacts, through our political decisions. We keep creating new risks. And risks sort of multiply because it's kind of like the more we know, the more we learn about something, the more aware we are of the many risks that might be posed by that thing. He also talks about them as being democratic, and you can go back to the lecture to see how I qualify this a little bit, but the basic idea is that a lot of risks, like, a global health epidemic or climate change, basically affects everybody. Now, how it actually plays out might affect us differently, depending on our power and resources, but essentially no one, in theory, can really shield themselves from the effects of climate change or global health epidemic entirely. He talks about how risk can be manipulated by politicians and the media to really play on our fears, and that in relation to that, we might be increasingly willing to give up our liberties in order to get more of a feeling of safety or security against these risks. And then he also talks about risk as being fundamentally about controlling the future. So a risk is not the same thing as a disaster that has already happened. It's an anticipation of something in the future that might happen, and in response, we try to manage that in some way. Now, we talked about linear model of innovation in this class and some critique of that. It's kind of related to the idea of technological determinism, the sort of notion that something is inevitable, it was always going to be designed that way, it was just a matter of time. And a lot of times, especially I think STEM folks think about that in the future, like, X such and such is inevitable. Autonomous vehicles are inevitable, they're the future. Well, maybe. But that suggests that there's one thing called autonomous vehicles. It doesn't really get into the full range of possibilities for autonomous vehicles, which there's a lot of possibility for how autonomous vehicles might be implemented and what our future might look like. And if the public was super opposed to autonomous vehicles, we could also just not have them. So sometimes it feels like these things are inevitable, but actually we have a fair amount of say about how some of these things develop. So the linear model of innovation is really, it's kind of similar in that it sort of imagines this straight arrow from science, research, to engineering, building the technology, to the market. And that it just kind of, every innovation just happens in that kind of linear mode, when in reality it's often more messy. There are a lot of internal loops. You might have new technologies that enable new forms of scientific research. You might have a whole economic and regulatory environment that enables or constrains particular kinds of research and development. You might have various roles that the public and the media play on different kinds of innovation. So undoubtedly, there are probably many examples where you had research, engineering, commercialization. So you can have that, but we shouldn't assume that that's how innovation happens. You should know the branches of government and how each relates to science and technology, what the role of the executive is, the legislative, and the judiciary. You should understand the relationship between laws and regulations, and why it is that I say that regulations interpret the law. You should have a sense of intellectual property, what the different forms are, why we have them, why do we have patents, why do we have copyright, trademark, design patents, and how, thinking about the talk this week, how might patent systems be modes of governance? And also, even though we usually think about intellectual property as inspiring and enabling innovation, I think it also came through in this talk that sometimes it gets in the way. You can think about this in biotech. You can think about this in a lot of domains where, maybe some big company has all the patents on a particular thing, but they're just sitting on it. But nobody else can kind of get in there and do research and development on that because of the patent landscape. So there are lots of ways, you see this a lot of times in software with the open source movement, or people who are really advocates of open source software, that there can be a real resistance to patents because they can also limit innovation. We talked about globalization as having both positive and negative connotations. Most scholars of globalization will really point to changes in information and communication technologies as being key to what we think of as globalization, the ways in which those have really made distance a non-issue on some level, and have made it enabled the flows of people and knowledge and technology and labor and culture across the boundaries of nation state. This has brought with it a number of probably really positive things and also maybe some not so positive things, depending on who you are. So when you hear that term, you really want to think about who's using it, in what context, for what purposes, with what connotations, because it doesn't just mean one thing. And we talked about science as both requiring and benefiting from global or international cooperation, and also sometimes being necessary to address problems that are really global in nature. We talked about treaties and conventions and protocols. And in the lecture, I go over the 4 steps of making a treaty and, agreeing on a problem, negotiating, ratifying protocols. You should understand the relationship between conventions and protocols. We talked about democracy somewhat. I mean, the main point is that in a democracy, the underlying assumption is that science and technology should be for the public good. The real kicker, though, is that what the public good is and how we achieve it, of course, there's a lot of disagreement about. And so we really duke it out in the public sphere, trying to figure out, especially in relation to science and technology, what is the public good and how do we best arrive there? And that can really vary depending on who you're talking to. In the area of geopolitics and energy, the most recent reading really focused on how energy is a geopolitical issue, so is climate change. Geopolitics meaning relations between nation states. And then we also talked about international regimes and international governance. Now, international regime can be a supranational organization, but also it could be sets of principles, norms, or rules for governing issues between nations. So you could have, the United Nations as a supranational or as an international regime, but you can also talk about the UNFCCC as an international regime. In the lecture, I talked about requirements of statehood, territory, people, government, autonomy, and recognition. We talked about precautionary principle, and you read a pretty sizable reading on that. And that's because I think that the precautionary principles is a really interesting, it's a risk management strategy that I think is really interesting for thinking about how we anticipate risk. It's an anticipatory strategy. It's basically saying, look, if we don't know that it's safe, maybe we should hold off. Maybe whoever's trying to introduce it should actually do the research to prove, to show that this is safe before it goes out into the world or goes out into the public. It doesn't require 100% security. I mean, there can be some risk and uncertainty, but there should be a reasonable confidence that it's safe before it goes forward. Now, this isn't really employed in the U.S. context that much. It's much more common, I would say, in Europe and international contexts, international governance. And that's because, going back to the talk from this week, we tend to like to leave everything to the market and say, the market's going to determine if this is bad, then the market will sort of weed it out. But I think it's a really interesting strategy. I think it's something you guys can be thinking about how that plays out with your technology. We also talked about innovation regimes, and I'm thinking about the New York nanotechnology model to think about the role of universities, both state and federal, industry, NGOs, researchers, etc., and how both public and private come together to really make innovation happen in the U.S. context. And then finally, you'll have one more reading before your midterm on technologies as forms of life. And I wanted to close with this reading because I think that in your report, ultimately you want to come back to a kind of so what. And the so what for me, for political economy, comes back to this question of public good. And how do we innovate in a way that really achieves our goals and desires of providing some benefit to the public, providing some benefit to the world maybe. And so Langdon Winner in this article asks us to think about technologies not just as devices, but as forms of life. And by that he means if we don't just look at the device, but we say, who are we with this device? It's not just a smartphone. Ooh, I have a missed call. It's who am I as a person, and who are we in society using smartphones? What does that look like? What sort of modes of engagement? How does that impact the way I interact with people? How I think, how I learn, how I do things? It's not just an autonomous vehicle, but who are we with autonomous vehicles? What modes of life, what modes of engagement? How might we move in the world? How might our commutes be different? How might our interactions and our mobility be different? Who are we with cultured meat? if we really move away from cows and we really embrace cultured meat, what does life look like? How is that a different form of life? How do we buy and cook and eat this cultured meat? How do we interact with people who eat cows? How does what are all these peripheral effects that we've been learning about with cultured meat? How does that change things with energy? Who are we as people, and what forms of life are enabled or constrained when we engage in solar radiation management and other geoengineering techniques, carbon capture? Who are we as people? What forms of life are enabled by a real investment in nuclear power? What if we have a number of nuclear power, new plants? What if we really move away from fossil fuels? How does that look different than really reinvesting in coal? So it tries to kind of change the focus and look at the kind of big picture and say, if we really try to imagine these as forms of life, that might help us to really think about what is the public good, as well as what kinds of policies or regulations might be appropriate to help channel this toward what you guys hopefully learned in 131, this idea of like a flourishing society. What is the world that we're trying to create together, and how does this form of life contribute to that, or what kind of form of life would it need to be to contribute to that? And so when Langdon Winter talks about technological somnambulism, he's really talking about what happens if we just sort of sleepwalk through all of our innovations, if we just don't pay attention and we kind of just go yeah, and the market takes care of it, and there's nothing else to think about or ask or challenge or concern ourselves with. Well, maybe in that case, it is a kind of it allows for technological determinism, because in a way it's like these technologies just sort of happen to us. But maybe that's on us. Maybe if we really sort of wake up and open our eyes and engage and really think critically as scientists, as engineers, as consumers, as citizens in a democracy, what kind of a world are we trying to create? How do we want to invest the resources we have? What kinds of innovation, are really helpful for public good, that pushes away from technological determinism and makes us really active participants in this process. So I was hoping that would help you to kind of think about the so what of political economy, as well as the so what of your technology, and that maybe that's something that you could really think about and inform your final report. Okay, so that was really fast, and if I seem tired, it's because I did all of this once before and I failed to hit record, so this is my second rundown on it. But hopefully it went over some key points, and if there are some things that are unclear or you can't figure out where I originally talked about it, those would be some good candidates for things to post to the discussion board, although you can also just email me. So hopefully this has been helpful. I look forward to this final week of our class.